In this video, we are going to demonstrate analyzing code for creating methods, and we are going to work on writing methods with return values and parameters. So this particular code, we need to study it first to determine what we want to do in terms of writing some methods. So I have two variables, midterm grade and final grade. I have my data being entered. We need to input the final grade here. And then we have a calculation for determining the average of those two. We output the average, and then we determine a pass or fail. So as I study this pseudocode, I see what I call some business logic occurring here. And business logic is kind of like the calculations behind the scene would be one way to say it. But we are going to take and put this business logic into a method. And then I also see a decision structure here, which is also some type of a business logic, it could be called. And so we're going to actually, I think I'm going to create another method just to handle this. So I'm going to plan on creating two methods. One of them is going to calculate the average. So I am going to say my average is going to be assigned the result from a method called calculate average grade, and I am going to need two values to do that, the midterm grade and the final grade. So I'm going to have two parameters. So I'm thinking out loud here, but I'm also doing several things. I'm creating the name of my method, which is very descriptive using camel casing. I'm understanding that it's going to return a value because I'm assigning it to average. Let's go ahead and write that method. The code that's going to go in this method is basically this one line of code here. So I'm going to copy that. So the method, as we already stated, is going to be called calculate average grade. It's a very descriptive name. And so calculate average grade is going to return the average grade given. Remember, given is a keyword that kind of indicates parameters. A midterm grade and a final grade. So how do I start this? Well, first of all, it's going to return a value, which is numeric. So remember, my header line has to have a return value. So I'm going to say num, followed by the name of the method, and then my parameter list. Now my parameters have to match the same data type and the same what they represent. So this is going to be midterm, and then num, and I'm going to name it final. Now remember, I'm naming them similar but not exactly the same to indicate these are two separate memory locations. Notice I have them in the same order and I have the same data type. And then I have my calculation that I've already created, except we got some problems again. Remember, midterm grade is local to main, so it's not accessible here. So I have to use the local variable midterm, and I have to use the local variable final, and I'm going to divide it by, here's a pro tip, divide it by 2.0, so that's going to make it become, when we talk about other languages, a floating point number. And last but not least, we are calculating an average here. So this is a num, I'm going to say average, and I'm going to use the same variable, but here's the deal. Now we're kind of ramping this up. Average in my method is separate than average up here. And actually I didn't notice it, but I forgot to declare average earlier. So I need to have that. So the first average is what we call local to main. And then my second average down here is local to the method. So here's kind of a deal, and it gets a little confusing sometimes, but the deal is that I can have two variables named the same if they're in the different scope. Now, a lot of times we just name it something different so that there is no confusion, but you're going to see this, so I want to mention it. That sometimes if they're named the same, it does not mean that they are actually the same memory location. As soon as this method gets done, this variable no longer exists. It is only local to calculate average grade, so it's going to be gone. The variable in main up here is a completely different one, even though when I highlight it looks like they're all related. Ignore that, please. The variable average in main is a separate variable average in my local method. That is something that we will need to work on. And so this particular method then needs to return a value, and it's going to return average. Now, the other thing to remember is that it's returning the value of what was in average, or what was stored in average is what is getting returned. It does not return the actual variable because that variable no longer exists. It goes out of scope. So once that calculation is done and we return that value, we now have our average for our grade. This output is a little lacking, so we should have a label with it. So we should say something like output, your grade average is, and maybe do a colon and then a quote, and then concatenate or add a plus sign to indicate that we are adding those together. And now we're to the point where we're going to start our second method. As we looked at our code before, we said we were going to take this logic here and put it into a method. And if we study that logic, that particular logic's goal, it looks to me, is to be outputting a string. And so that means to me that the method should return a string. It's also determining a pass-fail status. So we're going to be doing a couple things here. I am going to create a string variable to store the results of that method. So we're going to have a string variable, and it's going to be a pass-fail message is what it's going to be. And so my pass-fail method, my pass-fail message is going to be assigned the result from my determine the pass-fail status. So my pass-fail status is going to be determining the pass or failing of the grade. That is based upon the variable average. So we have to send in a parameter. So I'm kind of thinking ahead and thinking, okay, I'm going to name my method pass-fail status. It's going to be returning a value to this pass-fail message, and then I'll need to output that message before I'm done. So then I would output pass-fail message. So to write my method, my header is going to be string because it's going to return a string. It's going to be named pass-fail status. And it's going to bring in a numeric value average. I'm going to paste in the code that I had before. And if we remember, I can use the same variable name as long as I understand that the scope and those variables are actually different. And so if I use the same variable name, it does not mean that it's the actual variable from main. If that messes with your brain too much right now, then you can rename this variable, maybe grade average. So we have a descriptive variable, and then write your method based upon that, which means I have to change this variable to grade average in order to calculate the pass-fail status. The other thing that's going to happen here is instead of just outputting, I'm returning this string. So I am going to create a string variable here to hold my message. So that would be a declaration. And I would then indent one level. And instead of saying output, I'm going to assign the message something like you have passed the course. So we are assigning a string message to my variable message, and I am then going to return that message to main. If I don't pass the course, we just make the message you have not passed this course. Because I have to return a value, I'm going to return message. So my transfer of control when I'm running this program, as soon as I calculate the average, we do a little output and we output your grade average is whatever it is. Then we call the pass-fail status, sending it the average value, and it returns a value here at line 19. But what happens at line 19, when I call this method, it jumps to line 23, it runs through all of this code, and then it returns that message to the point where it left off. So it jumps back up here to line 19, assigns the message to pass-fail message, and then we output the pass-fail message. And so that will be our second method. We write a comment to describe what that method does. Pass-fail status determines if a student passes / fails and returns a message that indicates that. That's what our method is doing. So now we have written a second method that brings in a parameter, does some business logic, and returns a string value back to our driver program.